Economics, Social Life, and Politics in the Gilded Age. This is my favorite time period. Don't ask me why, I just love it. It's fascinating. So, we have a big influx of immigration at this time. We are a nation of immigrants, and that's part of our history. And as we've talked about in class, at times that's been a rocky history. So we have a big growth of European immigration. A lot of things are pushing people out of Europe at this point. You have poverty. Most of the land was already occupied, so there weren't opportunities for European immigrants to own land really anymore. Their cities were really overcrowded, diseases, famine. They had high unemployment. There was also some religious persecution on in parts of Europe. An example being the pogroms in Russia of Jews by both the czars and then later by the Soviet communist governments. And it was relatively inexpensive to emigrate. The invention of the steamship made it possible for people to scrimp and save enough money to come over to the United States. Granted, it was usually their life savings. So here you have immigrants arriving on the East Coast. These were mostly European immigrants coming into Ellis Island in New York Harbor. Had a immigration station there where they were examined and tested and sort of cataloged before they arrived. If they had health issues, those sorts of things, they were often deported or not coming or trying to come in illegally. On the West Coast, Angel Island in the San Francisco Bay was used for a period for the same purpose, to sort of catalog immigrants coming in from Asia. Mostly these were the Chinese that we spoke about in class. So you had sort of two waves of immigration that have occurred in the United States, and we're probably into our third wave of major immigration if we consider immigration now coming from Latin America. But our first wave of immigration were what became known as old immigrants. And these were people coming from primarily Northern Europe and had come and could possibly even trace their roots to revolutionaries or shortly thereafter the revolution. And then you have these new immigrants that are coming in the mid to late 1800s, and they're primarily from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. They're Greeks, they're Slovaks, Croats, Poles, Russians. They tended to be Roman Catholic or Greek and Russian Orthodox or Jewish. So here you have some families making the passage, the journeys across the Atlantic. Most of these people, when they got to the United States, landed in New York Harbor, of the old immigrants, or if they're coming from Asia, in San Francisco. And they tended to crowd in ethnic neighborhoods in these large cities. And because of that, you know, they're first generation immigrants. They're not speaking the language. They're not integrating into society. They're practicing customs that were viewed by many older immigrants as foreign or alien somehow, sort of with suspicion. And so there's this pushback against this wave of immigration. And it's pushed by labor unions who see all of this cheap labor as being problematic for creating a living wage for Americans living here in the country, nativists who had kind of popped up during the Civil War, and this idea of social Darwinism, which was getting some worldwide attention, that Europeans were somehow, white Europeans, Northern Europeans, were somehow superior. It was taking Darwin's theory of evolution and applying it to social status and using evidence of white European social status to sort of justify policies of racism in Europe and here in the United States. So some of these folks were actually successful in pushing back. In particular, in 1882, Congress passes the first immigration legislation that actually limits a particular race of people coming into the United States, and that is the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so it places some pretty heavy restrictions on entry into the United States. So here you can see some political cartoons from the day. Uncle Sam thumbing his nose, even though it's, you know, we're in the United States of America where admittance is free. Come on in, walk in right here. Everybody's welcome, except you. And you can see there's some references here to anti-Jewish sentiments where it says Sabbath desecration, anarchy. That's connection to communism. and anarchists that were around at the time. And a lot of racist stereotypes are evident in this image that you can see right here. So there was this big move towards cities, not only by immigrants, by laborers in general, because that is where factories were centered and businesses were located. So you have this rapid movement of immigrants and native-born Americans moving to cities where factories were located. And with that urbanization comes all of the amazing things that are parts of city life, including mass transportation. We have streetcars. We actually had perfected in the late 1800s, early 1900s, mass light rail, and then we managed, with our love affair of the automobile, to dismantle it almost all nationwide, except in some of the larger cities. Residential suburbs where the wealthier people lived, skyscrapers, buildings reaching up to 8 or 10 stories, ethnic neighborhoods. These tended to be the places where the immigrants lived. They were crowded. They lived in apartment buildings called tenements. There typically was poor sanitation. And you also had political machines pop up there where people saw the advantages of sort of tapping into this sort of political wealth that these immigrants were bringing with them and manipulating their votes, basically. So some images of like New York City and Chicago here in the early 1900s, late 1800s. This is a typical apartment in a tenement. It was usually 1 or 2 rooms. Large families would live in them and reside in them. Not very sanitary. You can see the neighborhoods popping up in the New York area. Kids playing out on the fire escapes, if your building was lucky enough to have fire escapes, laundry hanging, etc. So from this, there are some reform movements that are born. With the urbanization comes a lot of child labor, children working in factories, discrimination, extreme poverty, etc. So you have some people who sort of step up and challenge the social norms at this time. You have some books that are pretty critical of our economic system and this policy of laissez-faire, or hands-off economics, that the United States was practicing, one of which was Jacob Riis. And he was a photographer, and he really realized the power that the image could create in evoking emotion and getting people to move and take action. So he published a book called How the Other Half Lives, and it was really instrumental in sort of painting a picture for people of poverty in America. Then you had women like Jane Addams, who was working in, I believe, Chicago, and they were living and working in these poor neighborhoods and providing services to the poor. Jane Addams becomes the first social worker in the United States, looking to connect these people and these new immigrants with services that they might need, like how to learn the language, schools for their children, how to get them jobs and housing. And part of this was coming out of a social gospel movement, a movement among certain Protestant Christian groups that preached the importance of applying their Christian principles to the society's problems of the day, and sort of going and walking the walk, if you would say. With it came temperance movement, got some footing after the Civil War, and it was highly connected to the women's rights movement and morality issues. Women in the temperance movement were convinced that drinking alcohol by factory workers was the cause of poverty in a lot of these urban areas. And so they formed groups called the Women's Temperance, Christian Temperance Union, and the Anti-Saloon League. And some of them were actually rather radical. They went into bars and smashed up bars with hammers and axes and smashed barrels of beer. They had songs. They held elections. They couldn't vote, but they really pushed to get counties and cities to pass anti-saloon laws. The town I grew up in was a dry town. Almost my whole young life. Wasn't until in the last probably 5-6 years that it actually started issuing liquor licenses. And the Anti-Saloon League had a headquarters here in Ohio, and it was really strong. And in fact, the one saloon that tried to establish itself in the late 1800s in my hometown was blown up. Pretty much an act of terrorism by the Anti-Saloon League. Some of the other reforms you get is this idea of expanding public education. So states start passing more comprehensive compulsory education laws in an attempt to increase literacy rates. There was this view that the democratic society needed to have a minimally educated population to perpetuate that democracy. And so people start using their taxes to support public schools, including public high schools. There's also an increase in the number of colleges, and part of that is in fact due to the Morrill Land Grant Act of Congress, which granted states tracts of land, primarily states in the West. I've attended two land grant schools, Ohio University and Montana State Universities, for the purpose of establishing universities. You also had private colleges popping up all over, particularly in the East, that were funded by wealthy families. And you have women attending higher education for the first time now. Primarily, though, women still can only get into the fields of education and secretarial work. However, and for the most women, the societal norm was that you would retire and work in the home if you ever got married. And in fact, most teaching jobs required that you be an unmarried female. Ooh, I think that's Montana State. Oh, yeah. Black education. This is W.E.B. Du Bois. After the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal was enforceable. You could have separate facilities for African Americans than for whites, and that white schools could actually ban African Americans from attendance. These schools, though, were not equal. They were inferior in all sorts of ways. Education-wise, the teachers were inferior. The facilities were not equivalent. They weren't funded the same way as those that white children attended. By 1900, 44% of the non-white population in the United States was still illiterate. So we hadn't made very many strides through the Reconstruction era. Booker T. Washington began in 1881 teaching students in the ways of economic independence and self-defense, and he's kind of one of the pioneers of the civil rights movement, and his instruction sort of set the standards for black instruction, setting a national standard for black instructors in public education. There's a random bell. At this time, you also have this new mass media that's grabbing the nation's attention. There is a mass circulation of newspapers. You have sensational stories of crimes, disaster, corruption, and scandal that were highly read. You would have serial stories that would continue through the paper. They would be sort of like soap operas in the newspapers and magazines. And in fact, the story, A Tale of Two Cities, by Charles Dickens, he was a British writer, actually appeared in papers as a serial story. Each week you got a new chapter. Here in the United States, you had major publishers who actually made millions of dollars on newspapers. Pulitzer and Hearst being the two biggest, and they competed with one another, newspaper men in the country. Pulitzer has even a prize for writing named after him. You also had magazines starting to pop up, magazines such as the Ladies' Home Journal, Life Magazine, etc. Some of the literature of the late 1800s, you have the Horatio Alger books, which perpetuated the rags to riches myth. People leading exemplary lives could struggle against poverty and sort of pull themselves up by their bootstraps to realize that American dream. Here's Horatio Alger. And his books often involved young men doing these things. Here's an example of his book, Strive and Succeed. Mark Twain, also known as Samuel Clemens, wrote politically satirical books of the time and poking fun at politics and society. He wrote a book called The Gilded Age, which was pretty harsh against people in Washington. He also wrote Tom Sawyer and the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. You also had Jacob Riis, like I said, How the Other Half Lives, which sort of shocked people into recognizing what was happening with regards to city life and slums in the cities and pushed for reforms in those areas. And then you had Anna Sewell, who wrote Black Beauty, which focused on the public on the cruelty of animals.